Hello and welcome to another of our live conversations on Let's Talk Leadership. And today we're being joined by two of our colleagues and friends from the sort of east direction that we are traveling in today. So Zahi Abdein is with us from the Middle East, although he's actually in Istanbul at the moment. And Paul Galante is joining us from the warm times of Singapore. So this is a first for us, because normally we tend to be Eurocentric or North American centric. So it's lovely to have a couple of friends representing other parts of the world. And we're going to be exploring a topic that we've just been sort of mulling over and thinking about, to do with how leadership, and particularly leadership development, plays out in different parts of the world, based on our experiences. So Brit has actually moved back to Holland in the last week, so she's with us today, but ringing in from Holland. Ian and I are still sedentary in the United Kingdom, and all of us have got experience of working with different groups of people around the world. So that's where we're going to start. Join the conversation if you want to, using the chat. If not, just follow us. Obviously, we'll post this on YouTube shortly, so you can see it if you can't, or you're not able to join us live today. So who'd like to kick off? What is our experience of leadership and leadership development in these different parts of the world?
Can I start, Matthew?
Yeah.
It was, I think it was this week, it was my anniversary of the last time that I physically traveled to do the work that we do. And so roughly this time last year, I was in Hamburg in northern Germany, working with a particular client over there. And this week, I've been working with colleagues from that same company, but totally virtually. And I'm just reminded of the fact that when you travel, you're much more conscious, I think, of your environment and the cultures and the nationality cultures of the people you're working with when you're in a different country, even a different European country, as the UK is to Germany. But of course, when you travel virtually, this last week I've been going from South America through North America, across Europe to the Far East as well, and Asia Pacific, as Paul knows, is a massive region. And of course we have from India right through to say Australia. And it's so easy sometimes when you see faces on the screen to forget actually what cultural differences you have, and the work that we do, you can trip over some of those things at times. So it's a good reminder, I think, to be much more conscious of those things. That's not my observations from this week.
Oh, you're muted, Matthew.
How about someone else?
Yeah, so let me just share. I mean, I'm sitting here in Singapore, and professionally I work in Asia Pacific, but Asia Pacific is a huge region, and I work with organizations where we have some people from Pacific, meaning Australia, New Zealand, East Asia, meaning ASEAN, China, South Asia, and they're all completely different. And they are often, I was going to say, forced to work together. I mean, simply because in relative terms, they are in geographic proximity, and it is a relative term, and yet they're culturally extremely diverse. And so in a way, they are more used to, they're relatively used to these kind of differences amongst each other, if you will. So again, there's no such thing as Asia. It's a very varied set of culture, and with different ideas about leadership for historical reasons. So the ideas in Singapore, for example, tend to be of Confucian origin, and the implications of that. Philippines, 400 years of Spanish occupation has left them with some very different ideas about leadership. Vietnam is different yet again. So it's and the South Asians are, well, I shouldn't even lump India and Sri Lanka, which are completely different as well. So it's the assumptions we make on leadership are just that, assumptions, that people make very different assumptions of what leadership should be and what good leadership should look like. So great topic. Thanks for bringing it up, Matthew.
Zahi, how about you?
You are also muted.
We still can't hear you, Zahi.
No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Very quietly.
Just
No.
click on the button. So, as I was saying, that similar to Paul, when we talk about leadership, we have different countries in the Middle East. You have the Levant, you have Egypt, you have North Africa. Well, sometimes considered part of the Middle East, and also you have the Gulf. They have different ideas of what leadership is and should be. Even when you talk about the Gulf region, we have a lot of expatriates in the Gulf. I don't know if you remember, Matthew, last time we met face to face was in Dubai.
Yeah.
And it was a leadership development program. We had people from Holland, we had people from England, we had people from all different parts of the Middle East. And a big advantage of it is it brings a rich and different depth on the topic of leadership when you have open discussions. So
yeah, and I remember that experience vividly, because in the different table groups, when we had table group discussions, you would have some of our colleagues from the Middle East who were less experienced at having those sorts of discussions, but were deeply interested in taking part, but were coming mainly from organizations where the leadership was very much of the nature of that part of the world, in terms of there was hierarchy, and there was deference to age, and there was deference to family communities and things. Sitting next door to people who were very much from a Northern European, I think there was a couple of Americans as well, if I remember correctly, who had a completely different viewpoint of an experience of leadership. And I seem to think we had a bit of a struggle actually getting conversations going, because there we were all together as one community, but such wide, huge differences of experience and background.
Mm-hmm. And even within Europe, there are very interesting differences in terms of what is expected from leaders. I'll give an example of that. I was working in Scandinavia and coaching an executive who had accepted a new position in the Mediterranean, in the south of Europe. And before we started our session, he was busy making me a coffee and cutting a cake, and it was all very nice and very sort of what the Danish call hyggelig, nice, cozy, informal, sociable. And I just said to him, I said, let's call him Jens. I said, Jens, are you going to do the same thing once you are in your new location? And he said, of course. I have no desire to stop being who I am. So of course I will make people a coffee. And I explained to him that in certain other cultures, it would be very strange if the CEO got up and started making coffee for everybody. That would not be the accepted behavior for somebody in his senior position. Whereas in certain other countries, the country he was from, it would be the opposite. It would be seen as arrogant if the CEO wants to be served by other people. So that is all within the same continent of Europe. Already huge differences exist.
Yeah.
Let me share an anecdote that happened to me when I moved to Singapore, which for me was quite amusing, but also quite representative how people think differently about leadership. I came to Singapore and I was taking the place of succeeding, if you will, an American who was going back to the US. And there was a 3-week overlap whereby I arrived before he left, which was, of course, part of the plan, so that we could do a clean handover. And the question came up, who should be in the director's office? And so this guy and I talked about it. I said, well, I'll sit out in the open area. You keep your office. There's no point in you're not going to move. So we did that. So I arrived and I sat in the open area, and he was in. And this was a crisis, because as the incoming director, I couldn't be simply sitting in the open area. I had to be in the director's office. Okay, but I didn't want to kick him out. So what do we do? Can I take another executive's office? No, you can't, because that would represent that you are in that place. So anyway, it was a long negotiation where the American had to move out of his office to move into another office, so I could take his office, so I could officially, be representative of what I was supposed to represent. And I mean, it's not about it's what's expected. It's not. There is that certain power distance. There is that certain formality, and people are very friendly. It's not that, but you can't have someone sitting with everybody else at a different hierarchical level. For me, that was one of the early lessons of moving to this part of the world, which was I'm using at one level. The American and I totally blindsided. We didn't even think about this stuff, and it became a real issue. So anyway, that was illustrated.
Yeah, one of the first things that came to mind actually when we started this conversation is the term power distance, and we understand that different parts of the world have different power distance, and even within different countries within a region, they have different power distance, and that's where some of the struggles when you develop leadership in the Middle East is that you have to balance between the individuals and the participants that you have in front of you, whether you're doing coaching, talent development, leadership development. And you have to, I mean, it's changing. 60% for example, 60% of the Middle Eastern population is under the age of 25. So the younger, youthful population are demanding that we listen to them. So that power distance is shrinking, I believe. But it's a challenge. It's between two different generations, different ways of thinking about leadership. And we see a shift where people, previously thought, associated leadership with authority. And that's in recent years, I would say last 10 years is a big shift where people are feeling empowered. Not only empowered, some the younger youth, they just demand it, and they're taking that initiative and becoming leaders and behaving like leaders on their own.
Yeah, and things are moving really quickly, and I'm just conscious, and Ian made the point, it's been a year or so since he's been traveling. I'm conscious that whereas my earlier life was spent traveling in the Far East and in the Middle East, frequently living in some of those countries for short periods of time, that you sort of thought you started to feel that you understood the way some of these things worked. You've only got to be away from any particular culture for a short period of time, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, things have changed rapidly. I can remember working with the national museums in Qatar, and I was quite surprised, from my background in the Middle East, that many of the participants on the program were really, really well-educated young women from Qatar and from other countries in the Middle East, who had all been to universities in the States or in Europe. They'd got master's degrees. They were erudite. They were incredibly knowledgeable about the work that they were doing. Possibly very little experience of what we would call leadership, and therefore everything was of interest to them. And yet you can be in a room elsewhere with a similar group of bright, intelligent people, and you find talking about leadership, they know it all, they've done it all, they've seen it, they want something new, they want something different. And it just reflects how quickly things are changing all the time, and how quickly you can get out of touch with some of the realities of a situation in a part of the world. I look back on that work with the national museums in Qatar with real fondness, because there were a crowd of people there who were just absolutely wanting to absorb everything. And I can think of some of my virtual experiences and thinking, was there any impact made there at all? You know, I got it completely wrong. I was unable to pick up some of the things that people were interested in.
And is it possible, Matthew, that this is just a huge paradox, if you like, of having respect and empathy and understanding for individual cultures, whether that be more diversity of personality or country culture or maybe even corporate culture in certain regions, versus the willingness and the ability to respect that and also operate globally? Because business, especially virtually, is becoming more and more and more global. Organizations are attempting to corner the market in a global business more and more and more. And yet maybe some cultures or parts of culture are worried that their identity will be eroded by some of these things. And yet you can walk. I've had some wonderful experiences in China and Shanghai. And I remember a particular Irish head cook, and I forget her name now, but she was brilliant because she was there, the head chef. We all called her chef, and we walked in as participants or as guests. And she would always serve ice cream on the ice cream counter because she wanted to connect with her participants, if you like, in the case of a restaurant, the people dining there. But of course, her staff treated that as a huge disrespect to their job because it was their job to serve ice cream. But she respected it, but still challenged it. And I think it developed a wonderful relationship between her and the team. But it's really dangerous, if you like, because other people walking in could have been offended by it as well. And it's so complex. And yet there's almost like a tension that exists. And I'm curious about it, but I wish I had the answers, because you want to have both, right? And that's the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is an increasing in East Asia. I mean, I'm in Singapore, but Asia generally, China included, there is an increasing skepticism, I would say, of the Western leadership model. I mean, this, of course, has been borne out by COVID, frankly, and it's sort of there's a growing sense that the individualism that's been touted isn't perhaps such a great thing, and that, for example, in Singapore, we're in a very fortunate situation where essentially there's no COVID. I think the total count is 29 deaths, but the point is, it's what happens is people. When I talk to people here, they can't understand that what people don't follow the rules, what they actually have a choice in wearing masks. What I mean, the whole, this is applied to COVID, but it's like disbelief. And from the disbelief also, there's coming a sense of actually the way we do things is better, and not only to do with COVID. And that is more what we would call as Westerners hierarchical, but with the hierarchy comes the responsibility as well. So in other words, it's not only the people lower down the hierarchy, who respect the higher ups, but also higher ups have a sense of responsibility and act in that way, as opposed to just polish their own career. And and now there is this growing feeling, we East Asians or Asians have something to teach the world, which is a real reversal from the notions of Western ideas of leadership, and that's how somehow the West has the right answers, and it's all about individualism, and it's all about all the things that we claim, or Westerners claim, is the right way. There is definitely an alternative model emerging.
That's so interesting, and that's also, in a way, another paradox, isn't it? Both in terms of how do you reconcile that from different points on the globe, and also how do you reconcile it within yourself when you are a leader, and you have to be sometimes seen to be stepping up and being charismatic and leading the way, and in that sense being an individualist, whilst keeping everybody with you and protecting and serving the common good and all of that. That's also a very interesting sort of and that you have to have as a leader.
Maybe, Brit, maybe we should start a global cultural research project. So we look around all the national cultures around the world at Let's Talk Leadership in terms of our span of awareness. and we look at all the elements that would make the perfect global, worldwide culture that takes all the benefits and minimizes the downsides of some of those other issues, wouldn't it be interesting? Because I'm sure it wouldn't give any answer, because these things would be in such tension everywhere. You just end up making more of a mess of things. But I don't know how you would do that, because it can be a minefield, a real challenge on one hand, but it can be so enlightening, can't it? And I agree, Paul, immensely. And all the work that I've done across the world, you see these little pockets of what is almost genius, but you just know in certain situations it still wouldn't work. And I think that's both the challenge and the opportunity of leaders, especially our young leaders, that the audience we're really trying to reach out to with Let's Talk Leadership, to say, how can we help these young leaders coming into this process to embrace these things, leverage and manage these challenges without adding to the problem that you and I are creating right now. It's a real challenge for people, but an opportunity as well.
Absolutely. I think in terms of the Middle East, I think the oldest generation is more skeptical about the Western definition of leadership, or what's coming in from the West. However, I think it's the younger generation, I would say 60%. A lot of them have been exposed to the internet. Most of them exposed to the internet. Educated in the West, whether in Europe or the US. So they're bringing back those ideas. And that's where I believe that's where the importance of being authentic comes to play. Authentic leadership, and just be who you are, and just lead the way you think is the best way to lead, with a lot of empathy, with a lot of social conscience, and being conscious about what's going around you. I think being more of a servant, being authentic. I think these are the messages that coming from the young generation that we have, and I think it's evolving. I think we're bringing. I think we need. I agree with Ian. I think also we do lack a lot of research in the Middle East about leadership and what works best here. And I think that's there's a lot of course, competing companies. It's a huge market. When you talk about leadership development and coaching, it's a huge. The Middle East is a huge market, and there's a lot of money is being pumped into this. And but we still lack localization of the studies and the research that's being made. But again, I want to emphasize that authenticity, being a servant, is what's been working here, and that's what getting a lot of traction when it comes to leadership.
And I also sometimes have to question whether the sort of ideas and the concepts that we promote through the leadership development work that we do are not just very Anglo-Saxon in their approach, that I'm conscious sometimes that although I perhaps passionately believe in something that I'm sort of facilitating around, there are people in the room who may have a very different viewpoint and a very different way of learning and a very different experience. And I've just become more conscious that a lot of the stuff that we design around or that we use, the way we approach activities and learning, is very much Anglo-Saxon, Northern Europe, not even Northern European, because I know for many years I was involved with the programs that all of us used to get involved with Roche. And if you did a program at Roche in English, and therefore had a mixture of people from Europe, the evaluations on that program were hugely different from the programs that were run in Germany, in German, with a specifically German audience. And I spent weeks going through all the evaluations, trying to work out, because the client was asking, why is there such a huge difference? What's happening in Germany that's not happening elsewhere? And when you look at the learning styles, they're totally different. The experience is different. I've done work in India. I remember in Bombay for Asian Paints, and hugely clever, bright young people wanted to know all the theory. Give them an experiential to do, forget it. They weren't wanting to sort of build paper houses or put Lego bricks together or any of that. They wanted the theory, the methodology, the science. They wanted to, and that was their way of learning. So I think there's something around our approach as well that needs to be perhaps looked into and challenged.
Yeah, let me build on that. My experience both in East Asia and in South Asia, so in India as well, there is, it's about knowledge transfer, and that the idea that there's a right way of doing it. And so just teach me the right way of doing it. And it's not about the individual way. It's not about my way of doing it or your way of doing it. It's the right way of doing it. Now, that's true, at least my experience so far in leadership development, I would say certainly at junior levels and middle levels. When you get to senior levels, where that starts changing. And one of the reasons is actually for the reasons you're mentioning, Ian, is that they tend to, senior leaders, by dint of the fact that they are senior, tend to need to operate more globally. So they are more curious and understand that they need to lead differently in a global context, or at least in a multinational context. So there is more openness. But there is, some of you know, we at CCL did some research about global Asian leaders. And we did a big piece of research around the question, why are there not more Asians at C-level in multinationals? Now, there are many factors. Some of them are contextual, like why would anyone move from booming China to moribund Europe or the US? In other words, it's why would you move away from family, et cetera, et cetera. But some of it is also around the way that, so some of the things that were found was one of the challenges, some advantages, much more collective, much more collaboration and collectivism, and harmony, where, however, some of the things, the gaps are around curiosity, so exploring on your own, courage, particularly in terms of speaking up, and so those are two things that really stand out as being substantially less developed in Asia. But again, that's cultural. I mean, it's based on a different assumptions, which are certainly not wrong, but mean that it's less common to have Asians at the top of multinationals. The paradox is increasingly the really large multinationals are Asian, and will increasingly be so. And therefore, back to this thing, well, what is effective leadership? And it's very different. We talk about feedback. I mean, if you're a senior leader, they don't necessarily, it's not that they want to learn, so to be clear, but they don't want to lose face. In Asia, a junior person would never give, well, it would be very difficult to give true, honest feedback to a superior. The superior would not expect that. And therefore, you have to learn in a different way. How else are you going to learn if you don't get feedback? So to your point, Matthew, this Anglo-Saxon notion, which is an individualist culture, just takes a very different shape in different cultures. I'm finding out the hard way. I've been in Singapore now, or in Asia, therefore, for a couple of years. The only claim to fame I have is that I insert foot in mouth slightly less often than I used to at the beginning. But it's a learning. It's very different. It's certainly very different.
Paul, without putting you on the spot, because it's not the point of today, what's your most recent learning in that context? Not with foot in mouth, but in terms of that's another good thing to learn that we can share maybe with our audience. Even something small that you've just discovered most recently.
Well, I was facilitating a program virtually for a food company, a multinational food company, but their Asia Pacific region. An Asia Pacific region for them includes New Zealand, Australia, includes ASEAN, and includes South Asia. And I realized that this was a strategic leader program, so senior leaders. And the biggest problem they had is understanding each other across these cultures. Because again, the assumptions about leadership were so different. So and even in terms of, even in a facilitated environment, they express their frustrations, first of all, in very different ways. And it's a problem, an intra-Asian problem, as well as a cross-regional problem. So for me, that's fascinating. We just like the old joke from the 80s when Japanese tourists would arrive in Europe, see Europe in 10 days. It's the same kind of thing. Every country is different, every culture is different, and there are as many different ideas of leadership and developing as leaders as there are countries, pretty much, in the region.
Thank you.
So if we, from a sort of or from our shared experience, one of the things we always talk about as a sort of a fundamental part of leadership is self-awareness. The ability to understand the impact you have on others, whether that's a positive or less positive impact. And then we go through the cycle of, well, you need to use feedback mechanisms, you need to have 360 assessment. And if what we're now saying is that there are very large parts of the world with hugely successful organizations, maybe all of that needs to be completely revisited, because I'm suggesting it's inappropriate. It's not. It's trying to use one mechanism for developing leadership, and sort of almost in a colonial way imposing it on another culture, another part of the world, where they may already have very well established means of developing leaders. It's just they do it differently. I just wonder whether there's a sort of a conflict here that, what's the point of running a program that we might do where we put feedback in it and peer feedback groups and, all the stuff we do, when the actual culture is, there's no way I'm ever, as a junior leader, going to say to my boss what I actually think I might need to hear or she might need to hear. It's that you just don't do it like that. I, again, just referring back to experience in the Middle East recently, I was on the, whatever it was, it was so high, I couldn't remember the floor. It was something like the 46th or 45th floor in the World Trade Center in Qatar, seeing the head of Qatar Petroleum, a lovely man called Mr. Katabi. And, everything about going up 47 floors in the executive lift into a most huge office with the most wonderful views and the most fantastic furniture and everything incredibly grand would really made it quite difficult for me to. I had a very interesting conversation with him, but it was a challenge. It was a challenge to start with, not because he wasn't pleasant and open and welcome. I just feeling incredibly intimidated. And then when he actually mentioned that every morning when he comes to work, he makes a habit of speaking to the guy who cleans the bathrooms on the ground floor of the World Trade Center, because both of them are employees of the same organization. Even though there's 46 floors difference in the structure, it just blew me. I just thought, would I expect a senior executive in a major international company in London stop to speak to the man or woman who cleans the bathrooms on the ground floor? Probably not. I just wonder whether, there is a challenge that we need to give ourselves, saying, actually, perhaps we not got it wrong, but we need to be far more flexible in the way we see these things.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't know. Matthew. I love the idea of that, just to flip the whole thing on its head, to say, well, hang on a minute, maybe we're getting this completely wrong. And then I'm reminded when using Paul's examples again around his experience in this very large Asia-Pacific region of difference. If Brit, we come back to Europe for a moment, you've returned back to the Netherlands now in Holland, and I'm sure you're already seeing some very different cultural differences just popping up again, just coming back for a few short weeks. And I'd love to hear about some of those. And also, how do we then how do we blend this together? Because if we do have much more of a power distance struggle and there's much more hierarchical in the culture of the country that we're either working in or we're from, it doesn't mean people are happy with it. They may be respectful of it. And I think some of the activities that we do in our development work that we do with leaders, you actually hear that, oh no, I'm doing it this way, but it's because we have to, not because I want to. And it'd be interesting to know what that global choice would be if people had real choice about some of these things. But I think, again, it would be a lovely research project, wouldn't it, to see what works, what doesn't really work, and what should we do. My only worry about if we were to really respect all of the traditions, all of the national cultures, I'm sure globally we wouldn't change quick enough. And I think the pace of change and the need for change has to fight back at some of these things, not just collectivism and individualism, but all the myriad of different variations of culture.
So
for global, improvement, especially environmental as well.
Let me challenge a word that you use, which for me is amusing. I don't really want to, but I have to. And the way you're describing that is in negative terms.
Yeah.
But in Asian terms, and maybe also Middle East to some extent, but certainly in Asian terms, that's normal. If I'm a son, I have to behave as a son towards my father. If I'm a father, I have to behave this way to my son. If I'm a shop owner, I have to behave in this way to the government official. So it is having to, but it's okay. Mm-hmm. So in other words, it's not. Speaking to Singaporeans and others, I really it is a sense of obligation. But it's not resented obligation. It just is.
But is it? I think that's the question. That's the thing to check, because we think duty may be. Some people get massive pleasure out of duty and respect and everything else. And but I think even things like that we should just check and just a question, because the biggest form I think of cultural variance is personality. I think it's the biggest where I see the most differences. So even with all those countries within Asia Pacific, Paul, when you look at the individuals who live there, based on nurture, nature, and everything else, we get then another multiplier, it's huge amount. So I think it's just fascinating to know what are some of our assumptions, going back to Matthew's point, we're working on. And forgive me, I had many, Paul, as you well know.
That's a challenge. We all have these assumptions, many of them.
Challenging and testing them out, what is duty in terms of a leadership responsibility to respect cultural differences, and those that you should challenge for the greater good of society, the environment, and everything else. I think if we can learn anything from this very challenging year, there must be some massive opportunities to challenge some of the things that maybe we wouldn't normally challenge, at the risk of upsetting cultures and individuals as well. Careful.
You've moved back to Holland. How are you going to respond to Ian's suggestion there?
Sorry, I didn't quite. Was it to Zahi?
Well, Ian was saying you've moved back to Holland.
Oh, sorry.
I was thinking, right, come on, you must have, even in the last week.
Yes, I have, and it's really interesting when you think about duty and what Paul said about collaboration and the disbelief that he has encountered with people who can't believe that other people don't want to follow rules. I think the Dutch are a very paradoxical nation, in the sense that we love rules, we like rules because things have to be sort of structured and organized, and at the same time we fall on our sword for individual freedom, or are willing to do so, and that creates real tension. And Holland, being a small country with a huge variety, a huge diversity, a huge cultural melting pot, I think we can see some of the tensions that we brought into this conversation being played out on the streets of Leiden, where I'll be living now. Very, very interesting. It's also to do with, does the sense of duty, does that balance out the need to have a good time and to be happy and to be fulfilled, and what does that take? And intergenerationally, when you've come into another country, like a lot of people have come into Holland, into the Netherlands from other cultures, when you see your parents being more dutiful than your peers in school, because it's a very different culture, how do you deal with that, and how do you find the balance there? It's fascinating. Yeah.
I mean, I I'm reflecting on a conversation I had, listening to that, a conversation I had in Japan. Gosh, it must be in 1986, 87. And I was in the offices of Marubeni Corporation in downtown Tokyo. And I'd got to know a lovely man called Yutaka Imai, who was the head of the whole of their meat business in Japan. Very learned guy, very interesting guy. And his sidekick, his sort of number two, was a guy called Mr. Kubota, who'd been in Chicago for 10 years in the Windy City, in their offices there. And I remember on one occasion, I was watching as 600 people who sat in front of Mr. Imai waited for him to leave his desk before they got up to go home. And I turned to Kubota-san and I said to Mr. Kubota, you know, what's going on here? Why are they all waiting? He said, because Mr. Imai is the general manager of the meat section. He is highly respected, and we never leave the office until Mr. Imai leaves the office. So I said, well, do people just sit here? You know, this was me being ignorant. Do people just sit here and wait? They said, yes. He said, it's stupid, I know, because I can achieve more in a couple of hours in the morning than most of my colleagues here achieve all day, because they're just sitting waiting for Mr. Imai to do things. And the next time I went to Japan, Kubota-san wasn't anywhere to be seen. And I said to Mr. Imai, where is Mr. Kubota? And he just turned to me with a very gentle smile on his face and said, Mr. Kubota has gone to learn humility. And he'd been put into an important role, but in a subsidiary company, because the Chicago culture of let's just go for it, do it, get on with it, the North American way of doing things was just not going to work in head office Marubeni, you know, downtown Marunouchi, where it was in Tokyo. And I just look back on that, I think, poor man, you know, there he was from a Western point of view, probably achieving what we would see to be action-orientated, leading from the front, you know, lots of energy. And it rubbed back up against the way of doing things. And yet Mr. Imai, bless him, when his last appointment, having been in Japan all his life, he knew more about food in the United Kingdom than I will ever know. He'd learnt all sorts of things. He was an opera fanatic, a ballet enthusiast. He ended up on a cattle ranch in Australia. That was his last job before he retired from Marubeni. And that was considered to be, you know, a major thank you from the organization that he and his wife could live in Australia for 2 or 3 years before he retired. I mean, can you imagine one of us being retired to a cattle ranch somewhere else and thinking, there was just all of that.
And you see, I see a little bit, there is a contradiction is what we are advocating in the West on leadership, because on the one hand, we talk about individual leadership, action-oriented, as you say, get things done, et cetera, and in this next sentence, we talk about collective leadership. And the example you're giving about Marubeni is exactly that. I mean, individually, it may be less efficient, but perhaps collectively, it's more effective. I don't know, but it's I think that we in the West, and I say we because right now I'm between and betwixt. I'm not sure exactly where I am, but certainly the Western ideas of leadership, which values individual initiative, of course, that is a positive. But maybe whilst we talk the language of collective leadership, we perhaps value the value of collective harmony and support. And of course, it's not an either or thing; it's a both and. But maybe the balance is different.
Yeah. Well, go on, Zahi.
I have to go back to Ian's idea. I think you need to get it started. Start funding for it, Ian. Yeah. The global research. It's an interesting topic because you guys had me thinking. Are we losing that the cultural aspect of how to lead or how to run a business? And I really don't have an answer. All I know, having worked in the corporate world, having led people from different cultures. I've always reflected on what was the right way to lead a team. I tell you what, I mean, and that's why I'm, I go back to what I've said earlier, is that being authentic, being true to yourself, being, I'll go also use the term psychological safety, allowing people to be who they are, regardless of where they're coming from, regardless of the mistakes that they make, and at one point, I led a team of 10, and we were all from, I think we had 6 different nationalities, and each one of them bring different challenge, different as well as opportunities as well. And the only thing that brought us together is that we had that, I think, safety, psychological safety, where we can openly discuss cultures, differences, the best way to run a project, and bring in new ideas and so forth. So that's how I would sum it up. I mean, if psychological safety, whether you're running a team from Asia, Africa, Europe, Americas, you have to be open, and you have to allow other people to be who they are. So
I think that's a really good note on which to not complete our discussion, because I feel we ought to be coming back to have plenty more of these, but maybe a good note just to sort of stop the conversation for a pause of breath and some further reflection. Zahi, Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great, and it's lovely to get.
Thank you for having us.
Lovely to see you and to get your viewpoints. And we'll do this again. Let's do this again. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Wonderful.